well, cool. Why don't we get started here? Thanks a lot, everybody, for making the time to be here over your lunch break. We really appreciate you. And of course, thank you, Jackie, so much for taking so much time and effort to talk to us about your work. I know that everyone's going to enjoy it and that we're recording it so that future students will also be able to hear about your work and find inspiration just like we all have through it. So a brief introduction, Jacque Rupp is a documentary photographer, and fine art photographer as well, based here in Los Altos, actually, right down the street from Foothill College. She's going to be talking today about her body of work, The Red Purse. It's a series of photographs that she has published into a beautiful book. And the images are on display right now at the Krause Center for Innovation Gallery through mid-June here on the Foothill campus, building 4000. Rupp uses her camera, Jackie, sorry, I'm reading clearly. Jacque Rupp uses her camera to challenge and question tropes, right? Tropes about all of us, which I really appreciate. And she also offers a unique perspective on the world around us all. In this body of work, she focuses on womanhood, but also on becoming an early widow and what that means to herself as not only a woman, but to her identity as a whole. And so without further ado, Jackie, I'm going to hand it over to you. Again, thanks everyone for being here.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I know we're on the heels of Memorial Day, so things are getting a little busy here. And thank you, Foothill College. Thank you, Judy, Ron, Kate. So really appreciate all of your support in this project. So what I was going to do today was I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am to give context about how this has informed me as an artist, give a little background on some other projects, but then really focus on my newest project, The Red Purse. Oops. Oh, Judy. Is that gone? There it is. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so here I am. I was a highly inquisitive child, always on the move, always asking why. I grew up in the Northeast in a small family, and we moved regularly because of my father's job. He was an executive at a company whose initials stood for I've been moved, i.e. IBM, and I attended nearly a dozen schools before going off to college. And I lived in that many cities. So if you do the math, we moved almost every year. And I pause when people ask where I grew up, because this was always a trick question for me. And I share this because I think it helps to explain why there's always these recurring themes around loss and this resolute need for connection in my work. Sure why this isn't advancing. I idolized my father, and he played a huge role in who I would become as a person and as an artist. Educated as an industrial engineer and psychologist, he was highly accomplished in both the arts and the sciences. He was brilliant, adventurous, funny, and I absolutely adored him. And I would savor our late night conversations, analyzing world events and hearing about his exotic travels. His universe was so much bigger than mine, and I wanted that in my future. But looking back, I see what was most impactful was his belief in women. And he encouraged all the women in his life to invest in themselves, be able to take care of themselves, be adventurous, take risks. He was an advocate. He saw no ceilings and no boundaries. So themes around female representation will definitely show up throughout my work as well, with a touch on feminism. But being a child of Depression-era parents, he also had his demons. And our relationship was a complicated one, especially when alcohol came into play later in life. But I believe that I'm drawn to the more dramatic and emotionally charged subjects because of this. And my interest in psychology and searching for a deeper understanding of human behavior was planted at a very young age. We lived in Woodstock when I was in my teens, which is an artist colony in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. It's also the place where the festival did not happen. I was actually too young to go to the concert, but I certainly was old enough to know I wanted to be there. But living in Woodstock, I was surrounded by musicians and artists and a community that valued the arts. And it was also here in high school where I took my first darkroom classes. And I immediately fell in love with the entire process, both capturing and processing images. The magic of watching a photograph begin to appear in the developer tray, the smell of a fixer, the sheer pleasure of creating art, and just spending time in the darkroom. I moved to California shortly after graduating from college, once I realized I didn't have to live in the snow in upstate New York. And I've spent the next 30 years in the tech world. It was an insane time. We were changing the world. I found my people. I found my home. And I would be the first woman in many executive roles over the years. And eventually, while working at Apple, was surrounded by incredibly talented and creative people. And again, in a world where the arts and the sciences came together, where both were valued. And I left the tech world with those values. I would spend hours as a child leafing through our stacks of Nat Geo magazines, fascinated by the images of the people and the allure of so many exotic, faraway places. And I'm sure this also contributed to my sense of adventure and to curiosity about seeing the world. It also gave me a visual language that I would tap into later in life. And I expanded this visual vocabulary through my passion for cinema and the moving image, enthralled by the drama intensity of Hitchcock films like The Birds and Vertigo, and I still get a visceral reaction when I visualize them. And of course, the many James Bond films I watched with my father as a young child, mesmerized by the colors, the action, and the intensity. Then later, the psychological noir crime thrillers like David Lynch's Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet came into play, and other classics like Pulp Fiction and Body Heat. Both the femme fatale and the dramatic cinematography captivated my mind and took me to a place of mystery and intrigue. I've studied many photographers and have taken many workshops over the years to develop my practice. And I'm fortunate many of my teachers and fellow students are also very close friends, and many are on the call today as well. But scanning through this now, I realized that one of the real standouts from the masters for me was Dorothea Lange, who showed us how powerful one single image could be in impacting change. And as seen above in Migrant Mother, it still haunts me today. Then there are more contemporaries like Steve McCurry and Sebastian Salgado, who show us everyday people in faraway places, often very challenging situations, yet always with such dignity and grace. They care, so we care. They connect, so we connect. And then more personally from workshops, people like Sig Harvey with her dramatic use of color, Eleanor Carucci, and her honest and often raw portrayal of herself and her family, and Jennifer McClure with her use of self-portraiture to make sense of a very difficult time in her life. They're all storytellers. They inspire me. And now I'd like to share some of my work, and you'll see me transitioning from photographing faraway places to getting much more personal and close to home. But regardless, it's always about people. After my kids went off to college and I left the tech world, I had the opportunity to explore other cultures in earnest. And for me, the more remote, the more off the beaten path, the better. And these adventures got me out of my comfort zone, fed my curiosity, and challenged me to grow. And I realized quickly that exploring places with a serious camera in hand took this experience to a completely different level. It challenged me. It opened doors. It gave me a reason for being there, a sense of purpose and a responsibility, and an opportunity for a more personal and intimate connection with my subjects. I too look for stories about everyday people living everyday lives, searching for situations that strike my curiosity, situations I want to learn more about, and often in very challenging conditions. India, in particular, has always held a special place in my heart, and I believe it's a sense of spirit and calm, as seen here in the crowded and chaotic streets of Delhi. My first visit there, I was on a business trip, and it was shortly after I learned that my husband was extremely ill. And it was so comforting because India is a culture that accepts death as part of living. And I found this personally so comforting. So I always have a special place in my heart for India. And here's an image that I took again in India, and it was during the Kumela festival a few years ago. And that's a festival where the year I went, I think there were 135 million people gathered in that space over 45 days, but it was crazy. I think the time I was there were like 35, 40 million people, and they're all there because that location, because it's where three rivers come together, and they dip in the Ganges River for spiritual cleansing. And here's a priest that I took an image from. And I especially love to photograph people, and especially what's happening on the sidelines. And here's a drummer that caught my eye. He was covered in bright neon pink powder during a Holi festival in northern India. And I followed him for over an hour, trying to capture just that right moment to capture his spirit. And then there's the playful, inquiring eyes of these two boys, which is so universal. Again, this was during the Holi Festival, during one of their parades, but they could be from anywhere. And I love the connection. Here's a young woman reading her prayers using her iPhone at the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The juxtaposition of the new and the old fascinated me. I took this during a trip to Myanmar, and we were exploring villages along the Chinwin River for a couple weeks. And here's a local taxi service early one morning. And unfortunately, and I think this is what's so important about traveling, is like with Myanmar, it's difficult to get there now. The world changed dramatically. And I find that, when we have the opportunity to go someplace, you jump on it because things can happen so quickly, change so quickly. Here's another one that I took along the Chinwin River. And we got up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and we just started wandering around along the shore, and we stumbled upon this fisherman's river dance, which only happens once a year. It was such a gift. Again, it's the magic of photography. This one is from Vietnam, and I spent time there with a group with an organization that was tied to children that were affected by Agent Orange. And I think another thing about photography, I mean, you can read about travel, you can read about places, but when you're there, it's so dramatically different. And we spent time with them. We actually gave them images that they could use for their marketing, which was nice. But just see how tragic it was, and still how tragic it is today. And more recently, I went to Colombia during an Easter festivals during that season. And, I'm always fascinated by the different religious and the spiritual practices across the world. There's definitely a theme there for me, that spirituality, and learning what's important in the different cultures and why. And I love to get in the middle of things, be a part of it. And again, this is in Colombia during one of the festivals. I love this little boy. And I've learned so much from exploring, and especially the fact that, what we hear about a country, especially the negativity, is usually very different from what I experience. And it's often outdated, or it's very specific to a particular location. And it's almost always coupled with fear of the unknown. And I feel a sense of responsibility when I explore. And the photographs and the stories that I share when I return are my way of giving back a little of what I've taken, a way of offering a new point of view and creating a new conversation about what we call, a foreign place. But perfect example is Colombia. When I went a couple of years ago, people are like, "Oh, you're crazy. The narcos are all there. It's totally out of control." And, that's not what I found at all. And I'm sure that that is still there a little bit in the country, but I didn't find that. I found a beautiful, safe country where people were just as curious about me as I was about them. It actually kind of reminded me of Cuba. So after leaving the corporate world, I wanted my photography to have more of an impact here at home. And it was right around the time the news was exploding with all the negative rhetoric about immigration, stories about how murderers and rapists were flooding across our southern borders. And unfortunately, it's still in the headlines today. But like many of you, I live in Northern California, so this was very real to me. I've been driving by the farms for years, seeing people hunched over the fields at all hours and days of the week. And I realized I knew nothing about the people I saw, nothing about their situation, and I wanted to understand what was really happening. I had spent so much focus outside of this country, and I just felt a real responsibility to shift to my own country, to my own home. And this project became The Unseen. And I began visiting the fields. I built relationships with farmers, farm workers, and learned about the NGOs and nonprofits in the area that help these communities. And I worked a lot with my good friend, Mark Tishman, on this project. And together we learned about the dirty little secret in agriculture, the one nobody ever talks about. And it's the notion that many of these workers fly under the radar and choose not to be seen because of fear of deportation, and that we, the consumer, know something's amiss, but we choose to look the other way because we rely on their labor. And we have a mutual pact of not seeing one another, a mutual dependency on one another. And that's why I call it The Unseen. I found incredibly hardworking people like Miguel, who shares the same hopes and dreams we all have, to live in a safe environment and provide for our families. I saw so much pride in the work they were doing, pride in knowing they were caring for their families, both here and in Mexico, and feeling that a very important role here in our country as well. And I was especially interested in the women like Maria. She moved to this country when she was 16 and started out by picking strawberries 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And yet with hard work and the help of some of the local nonprofits, she's now a farmer, leasing her own land and growing her own organic produce, which she sells directly to the consumers in the Bay Area. I saw how important family was. And Angelica, Maria's daughter, works as an environmental scientist by day, but she still helps her mom on evenings and weekends at the farm. And this is prevalent, in most of the farms. It's definitely a family event. And here's Maria working later that evening, still harvesting her crops, readying them for an early morning delivery. It's such physically demanding work, and there's so many things can go wrong. It's so dependent on the weather, the economy. When I was there, it was the heat, it was the fires, and all of a sudden they can lose everything. There's so much that's out of their control. And I met Berta, who, thanks to these same nonprofits, has purchased her own farm and family. And she also has bought homes for her parents and will be providing for her children as well. So I began, building relationships with the NGOs that help the farmers, and I saw an opportunity to help them. And so I started going down and photographing and supplying images that they could use in their marketing. And we also worked with some of the CSAs to bring produce directly into the Bay Area, especially at the beginning of COVID, because the beginning of COVID, all of the produce was sitting in the fields. Nobody knew how to connect the two. And so slowly they started doing a lot of just directly from the farmers right into the Bay Area. So I was part of that, and that was great. But one of the biggest rewards was I was invited to Berta's granddaughter's, Jasmina, her quinceanera. And I arrived at their house at 6 a.m, as part of the family. I was one of, 5 women at the house, spent the entire day with them, and even had the honor of sitting at the head table with Berta during the festivities. And it was such a privilege. And I was so appreciative, and I made them a book of the event. Her family was so proud of her, they call her Princess, and you can see why. I also saw how quickly things can change. And here's a typical example, Berta's family. There are 4 generations of women from the Magana family. The 2 women on the left were both born in Mexico. The grandmother and then Berta, her daughter, and are both farmers, came to this country and have worked really hard in building farms. But then the other 2, her daughter and then her daughter, so it's the 4 generations, have now been educated in the US and, have day jobs, they have desk jobs, and they're, no intention of doing farming. They will be leaving farming. So, it's good that there's, bettering their lives, but it highlights how important it is for us to continue to support immigration. We need the labor. We need a continual flow of immigrants to replace the future generations that will be leaving agriculture for the more stable, higher paying jobs. Now I'd like to show you some of my work for my current project, the Red Purse, which hits even closer to home. I started this project at the beginning of COVID during shelter in place. It was a time when life slowed down, when many of us had time to look inward and really be more introspective. It's the first time I turned the camera on myself, the first time I did self-portraiture. I began photographing myself out of necessity. I photograph people and I didn't have anybody other than David and myself to photograph. So I quickly realized it was an opportunity for me to tell my story, the story of how I navigated life after becoming a young widow. Almost 20 years has passed, and I have the safety of both time and distance and a new perspective. I'd lost my father, my husband, and my sister all from cancer at the age of 52. So I experienced loss as a daughter, a wife, and a sister, but losing the husband was one that just absolutely rocked my world. I was still a daughter, I was still a sister, but that next morning I was no longer a wife. The Red Purse is a story of grief and desire and the juxtaposition and conflict between the two. Early grief is a liminal time. You're not who you were, and you have not yet become who you will be. It's very confusing. Everything felt so surreal. And this is my story, but I encourage you to think about it in ways that relate to your own experiences with loss, and more importantly, about reimagining a new life and rebuilding. I titled it The Red Purse because I acquired this red purse shortly after he died. And I didn't know why. It was so different. It was frivolous, extravagant, impractical, but I knew I had to have it. And it sat on my dresser untouched for years. And over time, I learned it represented my new desires, my desires as a woman. And these desires helped me move forward. It's part fiction, part non. I went through a lot of my old journals. I interviewed many widows, widowers, children of widows, widowers, etc., people from different cultures. And I like to think of it as creating kind of my own movie in book form. It's dark, it's moody, it's scary at times with the femme fatale. So I'm going to share some of the images from the book and give a bit of a narrative. Yes, there was a huge amount of grief and sadness, but I also felt a sense of impatience to become whole again. I felt raw and exposed. And it was reassuring later to learn these exact words were used by so many other women describing this time in their lives. I was still very much alive and I wanted what I had lost. I had watched him suffer for years and I missed being touched. I missed being that special person. Young widows have no peers. There are few role models, few resources. The average age of a widow is 59 in the US, and I was in my 40s. And widowhood is full of sadness, and our culture is so very uncomfortable with sadness. It's something that's really difficult to talk about. So I knew one thing. I had never done things in a conventional way, and I certainly was not going to do widowhood that way either. I needed an escape at times, and I found comfort and sense of anonymity in an urban environment. away from home. Nobody knew I was a widow here. That speaks to this image. But I also felt very feminine and sexual at times, which was so confusing, so disturbing. I was still a mother of two boys. It was embarrassing and shameful. And shame is such a powerful and negative emotion. This is a page from the book, and can see how I've included some vignettes along the way, kind of acting as guideposts to give hints of what I experienced. For example, this one explains, again, how I acquired the purse. First date, silent auction. She eyes the red purse. Feminine, sexy, evocative. She's desperate to have it. She bids, she hovers, it's hers. I went out in the world and everything was so different. I felt so alone, even when I was with people, even with close friends. My identity changed immediately. I had trouble thinking of myself as a widow, unwilling at first to join that club. I paused whenever I encountered a marital status box in a form. I was no longer married. I was no longer a wife, but I was not ready to be single, and I did not want to be called a widow. Refusing to live under that shroud, not wanting my boys to live under that shroud either. There was a loss of innocence. I was so unprepared, even though he'd been sick for years. Everything changed that next morning. I looked for answers. I couldn't focus. I couldn't read for years. There was no one to talk to that could relate to what I was going through. So I escaped into film, imagining who I could become, dreaming about different personas. The edginess of noir felt so right to me at the time. It was scary. It was extreme, touch voyeuristic. And it was so different than me. I knew I needed to be strong, especially for my boys, and I needed to accept what had happened. That didn't mean I liked what happened, but I had no choice. It happened. Soon I was going out into the world as a single woman. Soon I would be going out as a single woman. Would I be attractive, desirable? I was so much older now. And I began to embrace the change at so many levels. First, changing my physical surroundings, making them more feminine, more me, then changing how I looked, how I dressed. I was creating a new world, trying on different personas, one I could move towards. It was frightening at times. Often I felt like I was on stage, like everyone was watching me, not knowing what to say. It was as if I was the leading actress in this new and imagined play. I insisted on experimenting, being open, trying new things, believing anything was possible. Part fiction, part nonfiction, both real and imagined. Everything was different now. I know this was all part of the process. I was drawn to sets and locations that gave me a sense of the 50s, the 60s. Maybe it was a sense of safety and there's nostalgia. Sidebar, I would visit hotel rooms on Sunday afternoons when the doors were open and they were cleaning the rooms, and I'd check out locations. And I could search for the perfect light, the perfect setting, the right decor. And many of my images were photographed in Carmel and San Francisco. And I'd carry my bag of costumes, the camera, the tripod with me regularly, so I'd always be ready if I found the perfect scene in the perfect light. And sometimes I would be even lucky enough to have a friend click the camera for me and help. I think Maman's on this call. Maman was one of them. Thank you, Maman. So this all really became handy, especially when I was in public places, having a partner. But I had lots of support, and I'm so appreciative of that. Here's another example of a vignette, and I refer to them as my Nora Ephron moments. And some come from my world, and some come from other widows, and us all kind of chuckling now, looking back at that time frame. I'll read this one. She leaves at 3 a.m., waiting by the valet stand, quite disheveled. She recognizes the attendant. He smiles at her. He knows. She slinks into the car. Another sidebar, when I was presenting this at Foothill that night, a woman came up to me. She's like, I know that hotel. I've been there. I hadn't been there other than to photograph, but anyway. Um, Slowly I began to take risks. I started dating. I had new attractions. I longed for a relationship, longed for company to ease the pain, longed for what I had lost. But with this dating came shame. It was almost as if I was having an affair, which made absolutely no sense, but it felt that way. Still feels that way at times. Metaphors played a huge role in the project, and I photographed what I was drawn to and kind of analyzed it later. But it really became a critical part of the story, like the use of the color red, which represents sacrifice, danger, power, sexuality, and passion, and the use of staircases and thresholds, which are in every Hitchcock film, and they symbolize a journey, a decision. I was two people, clearly in between two worlds. Feeling so awkward at times. There were so many firsts again. But nothing straightforward. And, why don't people talk about this? And why does it seem to be so different for women? There seem to be so many more constraints for women. There was often a sense of time travel. Time stopped, and again, everything felt so surreal. But also very hopeful. I was older now, I was wiser, and I knew I had choices. So it was almost like I was this teenager, kind of you're touching back on that time in your life, but you fast forward 20 years and you've got like, you're kind of, there are similarities, but you have so many more life experiences at that time. And I was a mom of two young boys. I knew I had to keep venturing out to move forward. I had to take risks. I had to be vulnerable and really just embrace that whole, this whole period of my life and just trust that everything was going to be okay. I was obsessed with Marilyn Monroe, probably because she was a young, iconic, tragic figure. I even visited Helena Drive where she died. This isn't that, but questioning never went away, but it gradually began to retreat into the shadows. And I became much more comfortable over time. And I eventually learned that grieving and living were not mutually exclusive, that I could do both. And even though things are very, very different today, I know things, and I know that things will never be the same. I can appreciate both. And I know now that I was doing exactly what I was supposed to have been doing, and it was all part of the journey. The red purse represents the elusive object of desire. It's about resiliency and doing exactly what I needed as a woman to rebuild. Red is both passionate and demonic. How apropos. And I want to thank the contributors in my book. One is Eleanor Carucci. And I've included in the book, there's a long conversation that we had, a very intimate conversation about self-portraiture, about womanhood, and a lot of different issues around. I encourage to read that, and then also Jason Langer and Ann Jastrup were both very, very generous in writing some really insightful afterwards for me. So I really appreciate all their support. And of course, Aline Smithson was involved and just had a lot of people. And Judy, I met Judy at one of the reviews. I won't go down that path, Judy. So here's the book. It's available now. It came out in January. Has a red satin cover. It's small and intimate, and I wanted it to feel just like my purse. Um, so I've shared parts of my story today, but there's a lot more in the book. You know, many, many more images. There's more text, conversations. And I really, really want it to be a universal story. It's about resiliency, and it's really about embracing that liminal time, and trusting that you can work through it and, and have a happy life on the other side. And it's been a truly been a labor of love, and the arts, can be so healing. And I want this resource to be, I want my book to be a resource and a catalyst for other people going through changes, men and women. And I see both connect, and I don't want it just to be about women, but I want to thank you for listening to my story. So that's what I have today.
Thanks a lot, Jackie. I just put there's a QR code here that Jackie has on her screen. I also put a link to the book on her website. Jackie, I'm curious, would you be open to not sharing your screen so we can see you front and center?
I did it
Thanks. Yeah, fascinating. I
back
really
here.
wasn't very well versed on your work before this book. So I knew you had supported Mark Tushman, but like your images as well are just very powerful, as were the stories that you had around the women who really, I mean, struggled clearly, right, just to survive here, but yet went on to endure and prosper to some degree. Yeah, I really, and the story about being at the table of honor at the quinceanera was just what a compliment. So I just want to applaud you for everything, for your creativity, your tenacity, just your overall awesomeness, to be blunt.
Okay.
We've got a couple of questions here, and I'm sure we'll have some more. So Lee asked a question, and Lee's still here. So Lee, if you'd like to
Yeah,
ask it in person, feel
sure,
free.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. Thank you so much. It's a really very inspiring and touching presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So at the beginning, before you showed your work at the red first, those photos, I was wondering, are these more belong to the photojournalism or belong to what kind of category this kind of photographers, photographers belongs
Oh,
to at the beginning when you show your photo from Vietnam, from, India, all this kind of places.
I would consider the red purse fine art. It's a story. Parts of it are real, parts of it aren't. Again, I think I always refer to it as kind of a movie in book form, but I would put it in the fine art category versus my previous work, which was much more photojournalistic style,
Okay,
but
okay,
always about people and always storytelling. I mean, there's still
mhm,
that common theme.
okay. Yeah, another question now to the rapper. So you you have the idea afterwards, so you construct the story and then take the photos afterwards, or this was, you record the things happening during the course of the years.
You know, I it was organic. It didn't start off as the red purse. It didn't start off about my story, but I
Mhm.
was stuck in my house like all of us with COVID, and I started photographing different things, and I kept gravitating to this purse, doing different things with it. And as I kept playing with it, and then I started doing some self-portraiture, which I had never done before. And all of a sudden I realized that there was a connection between that purse and how I'd acquired it. It was right after he died, and and my story. And I really felt that it was an opportunity to do good work. We have to tell our own stories and go deep and be vulnerable. And so that's what led me in that direction. But it was organic. And even, I kept going back. I was reading old journals, talking to people, and I'd keep photographing, and I'd catch certain things and I'd go back, what's missing. But I spent a few years at it, and it definitely was not linear. It was, I
Mhm.
started off very very Hitchcock, did a lot in San Francisco. that way. And then it kept growing and building, and yeah, it was organic. But but it was interesting as I started pulling it together, is I saw so much symbolism in it, and saw, that, just intuitive, but it was coming together. And the writing was really important too. I really started understanding when I started writing, which I
When did
hate
you
writing.
start writing? When did you start writing? Were
I
you
never
writing? I think that was Lee's, one thing they asked, like, were you always writing during the experience, or did you?
No, I mean, I had journals back then, and I did not write about the project till I was probably a year into it.
Hmm.
And that's really when I started learning and refining, and just kept refining and playing with it. And then, yeah, if I didn't do the book, I probably never would have done that. The book forced me to do that.
Mhm.
And it kind of started off with the personal essay that I kept playing with and playing with. And then I started playing with the vignettes, my Nora Ephron vignettes. I did, so the writing, I would say probably a good year into it before I started. But now I really see the value in writing as a photographer, even though we're visual artists, that writing's so important. Even if nobody sees it, it just helps us clarify what we're doing.
So can I clarify that a little bit? Because I have a
Sure.
colleague who's actually asking me about that right now, where she wants to write about some work she's working on, and she's not ready to share it yet. But she's not sure how to start. And I was like, are you meaning an artist statement? And she's like, no, I'm trying to form it more in my psyche. And so what was your process, was by starting to write the artist statement, or the forward, your forward for the book, or the introduction, and then you started to write the vignettes. Is that how you started to unthread the role of writing, or did you follow a more prescriptive kind of course?
Think it really was with the artist statement, the project statement, I was submitting to different portfolio reviews and things like that. So you had to keep, and each time I did it, I'd keep refining it and refining it. And as I talked about it, I'd keep refining it. The vignettes happened in the book,
Yeah.
but I just felt there was a real need to add some guideposts in the book, and
Mhm.
also to bring forward some of the situations that were universal. They weren't just mine, they were universal. Being an older woman and dimming lights everywhere. I still do that. David's always like, do we have any lights in this house? It's like, walking by the mirror, and we do this as women. I mean, there's so many things, and I wanted those things to come through, because I think the book is definitely about becoming a widow, but it's also ageism. And it was important to bring those forward.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Catherine, one of our students, has a question, which she was wondering, which of your projects most significantly impacted you? Was it this one? Was it one of your earlier ones? Is it one that's coming up?
I think they probably all did in different ways. And but definitely, getting personal was the most difficult. The one I'm most proud of, because it's unique. So I would say definitely the red purse, but they all were important, important part of the journey to lead me to it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. And Wendy's got a great question. Jackie, the cinematic quality of the book shines, and you're really able to tap into the humanity of the project as well. How much did this project contribute to your healing process? That's a great question. Thanks, Wendy. I probably should let you just ask it, but you wrote it beautifully.
Thanks, Wendy. It was huge, and I think I think a lot of artists use the arts as healing. And it was huge for me just to gain clarity. It was something I kind of shelved. I was strong going through it, muscling through it. And it was something that I could revisit, with space. But the other thing that was interesting is that it wasn't just about me, especially doing a book. I mean, my kids were going to see this, my partner was going to see this, and everybody had to be, I wouldn't put anything out there unless they were comfortable with it. So it forced a lot of conversations with, people very close in my life. So I think that was really healing as well. But it's interesting when we photograph and we share with other artists, and all of a sudden you're sharing with, a bigger world. That's a different discussion. That's a different sense of responsibility. Um, that was a different learn for me. And I was scared to death in the beginning.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's always important to look at your work in the context of the whole trajectory of art, and where that fits in. But that's a whole different artist talk. So Harry is asking, how did Marilyn Monroe affect the project? And how did Marilyn Monroe affect the story, the myth?
I just went back to it and I read this. It was a Joyce Carol Oates book called Blonde. And I just like every dot, for whatever the reason, I love that book. I just kept peeling back more and more about Marilyn Monroe. And I think it was that she was a young, tragic figure. And I think it gave me comfort. I felt like a tragic figure, certainly not Marilyn Monroe, but I felt like in my own right that way. And there was some kind of connection. I don't know why. I read a lot about her, watched movies about her. Like I said, I even went to LA to see where where she died. And it was just important for me to pull that into the project. So there were a lot of things that just, as I read through my journal, that I had to weave back into the project. And again, a lot of it's organic.
So interesting. Again, I had no idea. That's why I love these artist talks. Does anyone else have a question? Anyone else? Kate has one. Go, Kate.
So, Jackie, I would ask you, and I'm thinking of the students who are here or who will be watching this, and you really go seamlessly between black and white and color and the different choices you made. Can you talk a little bit about project, like why for each project you might have chosen a monochromatic or a full color rendition and how that affects the meaning for you?
So I grew up in the dark room. I love black and white. So I definitely started there. And I love it because it's timeless. It gives us, it shows us something we can't see with our eye, right? So I love that. And when I really shifted into color was this project. And, the color red was so important. And it's a backbone of the project, but I learned so much from doing that too. It's hard, you can mask things in black and white, which, in black and white, you're looking more at form and things like that, which I love. And I'm actually thinking maybe my next project goes back to black and white. But color it played such an important role, but it's hard because it's the form, it's the intensity, it's the right shades, and everything's real in my project. I didn't really Photoshop things. So I had to search it was another level. But the color red was so important in this project. And it's a thread that goes through. And it was a big learn.
Thank you.
Sure.
So speaking of next projects, this is what I always hated, right? What are you working on next? But like, are you starting? I mean, this is still very much alive and moving forward, right, in the world. But are you working on anything else right now? Or are you formulating your next steps or?
So, it's interesting. Having done this, I want to definitely stay with the theme around ageism. And what I'm doing now is I am writing a lot about it. So rather than picking up the camera, I'm writing a lot about it. I also watch, I get inspired by movies. I watch so many films, especially noir, all different genres, whatever. I love films. And so I'm just kind of cataloging images or ideas from that and the writing. And probably in about a month, I'm gonna go hide and just go back to the camera and start playing. So right now it's more the writing different ideas, kind of brainstorming, but I definitely want to do it on ageism.